It was July 12, 1975, and I'd just turned 16 the previous day, on June 29th. Ironically, our family of 2 parents and 5 children had had a really rough year. Greg, my oldest brother, was the oldest. He was a bright, athletic, and attractive 21-year-old. Greg was body surfing in Acapulco, Mexico during his winter vacation in 1975 when he was caught in a 30-foot wave and crushed upon the rock-hard bottom of the Pacific Ocean. He was instantly paralyzed after crushing his spine between the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae. Greg would have drowned if it wasn't for the desperate acts of friends, relatives, and passersby who actually dragged him out of the raging waves. Greg was kept conscious and immobile for 2 weeks in the crude, open-air Acapulco hospital before being flown back to the United States as a Navy dependent to Walter Reed Medical Center. Greg later described sprawling out in traction on a Stryker frame as taking up the space of 5 commercial aircraft seats. My parents were preoccupied with the consequences of my brother's injury in his new reality. 21 years old and restricted to a wheelchair existence. In addition to my brother's accident, my mother's sister and her father died between January 1975 and July 1975. Bonbon, our beloved family pet, died. Stacy, my oldest sister, married at the age of 19 and had her first kid in April 1975. Stacy and her husband Dave were staying at our parents' house on July 12, 1975, to look after our 3 younger siblings while our parents took their first short holiday after Greg's injury. They'd spent a few days at the Lodge of the Four Seasons, located south of St. Louis, Missouri. My friend Talissa and I were traveling around in Dave's new red Toyota Celica with her boyfriend David and his friend Jim on the evening of my accident. We had previously seen my sister Stacy and her husband at a local German festival. Stacy suggested that Talissa spend the night at our place if her mother agreed. Talissa's boyfriend drove to the outskirts of town to a party at the country club, where Talissa's mother would be. Talissa might then get permission to sleep over at my house. I recall seeing and speaking with Talissa's mother during the party. We all got back in the car and drove back into town. On our way home, there was an area known as the 8th Mile that was famed for drag racing. I'm not sure how long we sat around or talked with pals there. I am positive that at some time, while the 4 of us were in the car and I was in the passenger front seat, the car swerved off the road at great speed and my face smashed through the windshield. Then everything turned pitch black. I distinctly recall experiencing perfect comfort, as if I were free of all discomfort and body feelings. I've told people many times that if you think of your most wonderful bodily sensation at any time, massage, runner's high, or anything else pleasurable you've ever experienced from within your physical body, it'll never compare to the experience of utter comfort during that moment of blackness. I believe this is due to the fact that we experience feelings within our physical bodies via neurons and receptors, but you don't experience any of that in that state. I awoke to the bloodied face of Talissa's boyfriend Dave, slapping my face into alertness. I could tell his friend Jim was nearby, and that I was in a roadside ditch, ostensibly resting flat in a very long, golden grass. Dave appeared relieved to find that I was still alive. I asked him right away where Talissa was. When I asked him that inquiry, he seemed to look over towards the highway and see her meandering into the road, disoriented and with whiplash to her neck, as I subsequently discovered. Dave moved my pal Talissa to safety. Then I slipped back into an all-enveloping blackness. Later, I learned that several of our friends drove past the crash and phoned an ambulance. I recall waking up multiple times from that utterly dark nothingness. I imagined myself lying in the ditch, hovering over my body. My long hair was matted on the grass, my eyes were closed, and I had abrasions and coagulated blood around one eye. I seemed to be floating in and out of that completely comfy black emptiness. I recall the ambulance crew arriving and hovering above them as they carefully put me on a stretcher and placed me in the ambulance's bay for transport. I vividly recall the expressions on my friends' and first responders' faces, since I've rarely seen such care and compassion exhibited in another person's face afterwards. As I flew above the roof of the ambulance, I could also see and hear everything that was said at the scene. Albeit, I could see under the top and into the ambulance. I went back to my comfortable black state. I recall waking up in the local emergency room on and off. I ran into Dave, my brother-in-law. He held my hand in the emergency department and told me to stay strong. I recall hearing a very unpleasant doctor at the local emergency room say, "That's what those kids get for parking out there." That incredibly wrong and unethical remark disgusted me for many years. It unquestionably turned me into an advocate for patients in similar situations. I was conscious on and off throughout the next day at the local hospital. I recall all of my high school pals dropping by, mostly relieved to see me open my eyes. At some point, it was agreed that I should be transported by ambulance to the St. Louis University Hospital for treatment. Weighted tongs were affixed to my head for neck traction. During the 60-mile ambulance ride to St. Louis, I was awake on and off. I awoke from my comforting void of blackness in the trauma treatment area of the University Hospital in St. Louis, floating above myself, lying supinely on an exam table, eyes closed, with crutch-filled tongs and neck traction, seeing my body there motionless, as my team of 5 neurosurgeons stood around me, discussing my case. I could see I was floating higher than the ceiling and could travel through the floor or ceiling as I floated above them, and myself. People wearing a lot of white, nursing shoes were strolling directly past me, as I seemed to hover around their feet on the next floor up. I recall hearing the neurosurgeons talking, and one of them had a bald area on the top of his head. I felt like a ball of pure energy, like a swarm of atoms floating in a cohesive mass, no longer bound to that corporeal body laying down there, even though he wasn't dead, and moved from time to time. Around that time, I became aware that I was in a dimension that was far less restricting than our 3-dimensional reality. Communication was telepathic, similar to how we converse to ourselves in our brains. I became aware of a very caring interaction with another person who was full of life, energy, and pure love. He was like a Jesus-like figure, absolutely filled with light. There was a lovely library-style section where I could have a life review of my past, present, and future. Sort of like an exceedingly efficient fishbowl with a 360-degree perspective. That's awesome. After that life review, it became evident, telepathically, that it was just not my time to die. I must have realized that I'd failed to achieve whatever objective or task I'd come to complete in my life. I'm also very convinced I saw loved ones and family members who died. It appears like knowing or remembering anything in my review would be detrimental to my mission or task. From then on, I knew I had essential tasks to complete before it was time for me to leave. After I awoke from my coma, I immediately told my father about my experiences. He sent me a book called Life After Life, which helped me feel validated from my experiences by revealing that others had gone through similar experiences. When I told my chief neurosurgeon about my experiences, he was doubtful. He insisted that head trauma and/or chemicals released into the brain after trauma were responsible for my belief that the experience was real, despite the fact that I repeated things I saw and heard while he and his team of neurosurgeons were attending to my case, including details of one colleague's bald spot. After being released from the hospital, I returned home with a halo traction brace screwed into my head. I observed a significant shift. It seems that I began with such a cheerful attitude that I had immense peace of mind. Positive and peaceful feelings began to erode over time as a result of daily exposure to other people, difficulties, and stressors. I've discovered that humans have more power to change circumstances than we realize through our thoughts, orientation, and viewpoint. My brother Greg, who fractured his neck 6 months before I did, and I have talked about our experiences numerous times over the past 37 years. He was jealous because I had an out-of-body, near-death experience while he didn't. He claimed that as he drifted face down in the Pacific Ocean, he had no idea he couldn't move, was paralyzed, or was about to die. Instead, he expressed his disappointment, saying, "Damn, now I won't be able to meet up with pals in Florida following this trip."